joining today, especially this is a weekend. So I really want to appreciate the time that you've taken to join with us. I know you're really busy. So that is something really, quite extraordinary for us. So that somebody like you who is so distinguished, so distinguished, I don't want to say extinguished, so distinguished to join with us. So that's really, really, I'm really grateful for that. So before we get, further to in the program, I would like to kind of first have a bit of introduction about you. If you can, please tell us a little bit about you, what your interests are, and kind of your area of expertise.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Shirash. It's a great pleasure. Well, I'm a behavioral economist by training, so I look at people's behavior through two competing lenses, if you will: the economic lens, so rational decision making, self-interested decision making, very individualized thinking, and then we're trying to complement that with psychology, right? So the idea that we're mere mortals, that we have lots of biases, that we have very complicated processes going on in our brains, and that we are also social animals, right? That we are living together, and that we have feelings for each other that could be positive, could be negative, anything from compassion to hatred. And these things sort of are two lenses that might be competing, but that could also just be complementary to each other. And as a researcher, I've focused on the determinants of trust and cooperation in organizations, in teams, between individuals, and the incentives behind that, and the motives behind that, and the factors, environmental factors, if you will, that foster cooperation and trust between individuals. Yeah.
That is quite interesting, right? Because it kind of combines something that people might think of it as. So economics is something that you are focused on as a general idea of a subject, and something completely different in a certain way is psychology and how people think, right? So combining these two great ideas together formulating ideas behind these two things is, to me, I find it to be extraordinary, with potential, because especially how to formulate something like psychology into mathematical models and things like that. That is, for me, even to, I don't know much about economics, to be honest with you, but even the little I know is quite fascinating to me, right? So I can totally understand what, how you might be finding it so fascinating, and why you are kind of being driven to study more about it. We'll get into, of course, your how you came to be where you are and your journey, or up to this point, of course. But before we get into the quite serious subjects, I would like to first ask you. This is something that we always ask all our guests: is that do you first just want to tell us a little bit about a book that may have interested you, or actually made a serious impact on your life? Do you have an example for us?
Yeah, I read a lot. I'm an avid reader of fiction and nonfiction, and I think fiction is very important. Sometimes as academics we tend, or as tech people or whoever, we tend to focus on professional reading, reading that is maybe non-fictional, maybe, which I also enjoy, but I think fiction has this very important aspect that it transports us into other people's minds, and forces us to acknowledge that everybody has their own perspective, and
Absolutely. Yeah.
and especially, I mean, for me as a white male, cishet, neuronormative, able-bodied person, I think it's even more important to acknowledge that. And I love reading from perspectives that are not my own. So
It gives
one
you
book that
it gives you a kind of a window into somebody else's soul, and of course see things from a different perspective, which you may never have thought about, right? Because you can't get into somebody else's mind, at least not yet. So that's the closest thing that we have, right? So yes.
And there are many books that can give you that. And one that I treasure quite a lot is Irjan Pereshkzad, is My Uncle Napoleon. It's if you've got any listeners from Iran, they will know that it's one of the most famous Iranian novels, and was made into a TV show. And it's a hilarious coming of age story from the Tehran of the 1940s, and narrated like from the perspective of an older narrator, but telling his youth. And this Uncle Napoleon is this patriarch who's so full of himself, but is basically telling a lot of lies about his past, but starts then to actually believe himself in these lies, and it's absolutely hilarious. And the nice thing is it lampoons a lot of different characters, but very lovingly. You know exactly their motives, and okay, they are not at heart bad people, and
Yes.
and it's actually it's very touching also at the end. So it's this mixture of hilarity and poignancy at the end, which is extremely nice. And I think these entertaining but also psychologically deep stories, they resonate a lot with me. There's also similarly like Naguib Mahfouz, the Nobel Prize winner in literature. He wrote Palace Walk. It's Egypt in the early 1900s, and one of the most fascinating psychologists, in my opinion, as a writer, where this ability of a writer to empathize with a whole cast of different people, different genders, different backgrounds, different politics, and make them human, and this kind of compassion for wildly different people. It's fascinating. So these two books in particular, but I enjoy a lot of more modern writers. Everything by Michael Chabon.
We are definitely going to get into more of those for sure.
Anyway,
because I know because we spoke earlier, a few weeks ago, and definitely you mentioned that you are an avid reader, and so I do read a lot as well. However, I'm always fascinated to learn from what other people read. So, for example, the one that you mentioned about My Uncle Napoleon, I've never heard of it, but I'm definitely going to check it out because you gave such an amazing description about it. So that just made me really want to actually go and check it out. So thank you for that. But we're definitely going to get into other things in your list, because I'm fairly confident that it's going to be a great list today. So going back to your childhood, and going back to your starting point of your career, as it were, in some ways. What was your childhood like growing up in Germany, I believe? And, how did that kind of put the foundations into the way you think right now, the way you understand the world?
Well, one thing that defined my childhood was I grew up in Germany to a German father and a French mother. So we spent a lot of
Very,
time
very different,
in
very
France.
different cultures, right?
Well, I mean, it's both Western Europe,
Yes.
Yes. To some extent, it's very similar, but at the very least, even as a standard issue white male, I got at least a little bit
Yes.
of perspective.
Yes.
There are different
Yeah.
countries.
Yeah.
My first name is not a typical German name, so with the accents, many people get that wrong. So I got at least a little glimpse. And okay, there are different kinds of people, and there are different countries, and I mean, no discrimination or no. I got all the privileges. I had a very sheltered childhood, but yeah. I was fascinated by books. I read a lot. I wanted to become an inventor when I was a little kid.
Right.
I drew a lot of machinery. So, and I think for a while it was really an option to become an engineer or a physicist or something
Mechanical,
like that.
right. Something to work with your hands and things like that.
Yeah. And while I was at school, I interned at my dad's employer, which is a chemical plant. So I got to see that. But then in school, I mean, I'm not bad at math, but I was like, okay, if you want to be like cutting edge physicist or cutting edge mathematician, you really need to be a bit better. And I was like, okay, I mean, I like math. It's not bad, but maybe not hardcore. And then it came to happen that I had a very good social sciences teacher, and I discovered, social problems, economic problems through him, and that you can actually use mathematics there too in economics. And it was mostly through the influence of that teacher. I think many people have that you go to school and it's not necessarily the subject, but it's if you have the right teacher in the right subject, then that will influence you a lot. So I started studying economics in Bonn, University of Bonn, Karl Marx's alma mater.
Yes, absolutely.
And then I discovered what probably many people discover when they do economics, that you have this idea that it's a social science, that it's about policy, but then at least in undergrad, it's very formalized, and you don't really get to talk about social issues a lot. You don't get to talk about competing approaches to policy, to how you would fix things, and it was dry, and it was not what I expected until I got to this other person who taught the behavioral economics elective that
that was in University of Bonn as well, or?
I stumbled into that elective mostly not expecting anything, and then I discovered that this is actually where we talk about flesh and blood people, and try to use our economics outlook, but in a more realistic way. And that was sort of the glimpse of hope I had in that field, and I want to do more of that.
Right.
And then I discovered, University of Zurich is one of the centers in Europe where
absolutely.
Nowadays it's very popular, but when I started with my PhD, it was not that present in a lot of Western European faculties. So there were a couple of hubs, and Zurich was a big hub back then, is still a big hub. And so I went there for my PhD to specifically do behavioral economics. And it was a great time. I even did a study in neuroeconomics where you use these these magnets to basically change people's neural function.
That's very cutting edge, as it were.
To the skull, and then see what happens, and you let them do your experimental games and see how they change behavior if you apply magnetic fields to the brain and then disturb the neural networks below. And that was pretty cool, I have to say. I'm not a neuroscientist, but it's highly interdisciplinary. You need to work with experts in other fields, and then
so it was more like combining neuroscience and economics in some way together to understand how the behavior is changing. Is that kind of the idea behind it?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, there's a workhorse game if you want to investigate trust and trustworthiness. It's called the trust game or the investment game. So you've got two players. One player gets some money and then can invest into the other person. The money gets multiplied. So you've got sort of like an investment that you make in another person, but then the other person has to decide how much to give back, right? And so the first person has to trust the second person, and the second person can then turn out to be trustworthy or not. And then one thing that is kind of standard knowledge is that repetition helps with trust and trustworthiness, right? If you meet each other again and again, that will make create this shadow of the future. You can build a reputation, and then people tend to trust and be rewarded for that trust. And then we coupled that with some neuroscientific insight. There was a brain area that had already been shown to be involved in sort of long-term planning and higher cognitive functions. And we hypothesized that if you disrupt that, then maybe people don't really care about their reputation anymore, and it turned out to be true, right? So people who were under the influence of that TMS magnet, they would not repay the trust that was put into them, even to their detriment in the future, right? So they would destroy their reputation.
That's very interesting.
It was. I didn't pursue neuroeconomics, and that area is still a bit niche, I would say, because there's still a debate on how useful it is. So economists tend to dismiss it as some quirky pastime that is not necessarily useful. But yeah. I then stayed a little bit on for a postdoc in.
Sorry, before we talk about the postdoc, sure. I want to ask you a quick question, which is and this is a question that I have seen a lot of what I've seen in Twitter and in Reddit and other places where people ask this question quite often, and it's a place where people finish their degree, right? And most of the time they want to get a job, right? They will go into industry or whatever the field that they're in. But a select few would decide to go into doing a PhD, right? So it's a path that is, you're going to, at least the impression that you have is you're going to suffer in some way compared to getting a job, as it were. But you're going to go through that because you feel like you love something so much, or there are other reasons. For example, for me to do the PhD there was a very specific reason for it. So just want to kind of understand a little bit about why did you decide to go into doing a PhD versus saying, you know what, I have a very good degree from a very good university. If I go into most of the places in Europe, I can get a job without that much of a problem. Why did you decide to effectively travel the more difficult path, as it were?
I think two reasons. One was, as I mentioned, that I was a bit disenchanted with the standard economics approach.
Right.
Too dry, I could have gone into industry and then done industry stuff, which would be a bit applied. It would be nothing is applied. I'm actually moving towards applied, but also the idea of being in a corporate environment was not very attractive to me back then, and also not now. Later, during my PhD, actually was quite funny. I did an internship towards the end of my PhD, just to check out, am I really going to do an academic career, or should I go corporate? And was with a big consultancy. It was an interesting experience. It cemented my resolve not to go into the corporate world. The people, the consultants I worked with were all amazing, or brilliant, hardworking, but it really took off the luster of that mode of working and profession, and you're not necessarily helping your client, even if you want to, right? You've got all these brilliant consultants there, but you don't actually get a chance to change anything fundamentally. That's not what consultants are hired for usually, and that was it. I just didn't feel like pursuing that route. Absolutely. and that meant staying in academia and having the freedom to pursue questions that you find interesting. And that freedom was at the end what made the difference for me there.
Absolutely. And just to kind of recap that idea, right? So you kind of, it was a fork in the road where you decided to go down one path, which is the going down the academia and doing your PhD. But then again, you had the decision to move either to corporate with a PhD in behavioral economics. Again, anybody would hire you in most places, right? You can go into banking, to anywhere you wanted to go to, but still you decided, what? No, I'm in the right path. That's not my path. This is my path, and I'm, because that's where you went to, doing a postdoc in, where you actually started to, be in most prestigious universities in the world, right? So, so tell us a little bit more about your postdoc era and how did that go?
Yeah, I always, since my undergrad days, I wanted to go to the US. As an experience, both as a country and also just the universities there. And I ended up doing 2 stints in the US, one for 1 year in California, University of California in Berkeley. It was amazing time. San Francisco, amazing. I did a lot of work, but I also, did road trips and
absolutely
enjoyed my time there.
California is amazing, obviously. So
brilliant people. The academic environment is quite different in the US in terms of culture, I would say. It is very focused on, what are your projects right now? Where are you trying to publish it? And it's very focused on your concrete current projects and the publication process. And I didn't feel that super sharp focus in Europe that much. So that was quite a change of culture. And I experienced the same thing. I also went for 2 years to Yale, there I went to the School of Management. So it was the first experience for me of a business school. And they had the same kind of very focused view on, getting tenure, getting publications out, which, it is great on the one hand, but it's also, I would say, a bit narrow. But what I liked about business schools is that you really have a broad spectrum of researchers, right? You've got legal scholars, you've got engineers, you've got psychologists, you've got sociologists, and that is very fruitful, right? If you, especially as an economist, which sort of tends to be a bit parochial oftentimes, it's actually a good thing to have this interaction and this exchange, and that was something I found very, very enriching in that experience, and that sort of was this next transition. So if I want to be in academia, I probably want to stay at a business school,
right?
Not at an economics department, because I already was in that behavioral economics sort of interdisciplinary environment, and I think business schools are a great environment for that.
Were you collaborating with these different people in the sense that, legal? And so, because I would think that, well, it's an assumption, because going back to your previous comment about the books, right? So you see the world in one very specific way versus, the legal people will see it in a very different way compared to engineers, right? They have a very, very different way of, seeing things, right? So was collaboration a big part of that environment compared to, let's say, working in a different, was the collaboration a big part of that?
It's a very good question, because it's actually not, and it's not encouraged, and it's not encouraged because of the way publications work and departments work. Even if in a business school you have, when you want to publish, the way it works is usually each department has a list of publications they like and they would like to see you publishing in, right? And then if you go to an economics department, that would consist largely of economics journals, and these are not encouraging interdisciplinary views. If you go to a business school, you can publish in a broader array of journals from different disciplines, but then these journals oftentimes are not very open to interdisciplinary research. Right. You've got editors who are in that field. Like if you want to publish in a sociological journal, you have to cater to these editors. You've got to cater to the typical audience of these journals. And so in terms of publications, it's not necessarily encouraged to be multidisciplinary like that.
That's very interesting, is it not? Because I know we are kind of going to a different thing to talk about, but I find it very interesting because in some ways, so you're right? So for example, imagine that somehow, for whatever reason, and of course, I'm just keep making a name of a journal just because it's a historically, like British Medical Journal, that has been there forever, right? Of course, its focus is medicine and so on, right? So let's say hypothetically, somebody wanted to publish economics and medicine, which is two completely different ideas. Most likely, even though the idea may be good or idea is something that's sound, there is some hurdles that you need to go through, more hurdles than you have to effectively to publish there. So in some ways, even though publications and journals are a way of providing research to people, in some ways it's also limiting that blue sky thinking and thinking about things in a wider perspective, right? So that's a very interesting behavior that we see in some ways in research, right? So that's I feel like it's a detriment in what.
Definitely, it is. There are outlets that are more general readership focused. So of course you've got
Like
Nature and Science.
Nature and things like, yeah.
Our neuroeconomics study was published in PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is also a broad outlet. But there aren't that many, especially not, I mean, at the top level, yes, but there are no medium level outlets like that a lot. And then you still have to cater to, or you still have to write for specific editors. And then with these broad journals, question is, what kind of referees do you get?
Right.
And there are usually, so if you, as an economist, publish in one of these journals, it's discounted, because of the editorial process. They're like, no, if you publish with the American Economic Review, it's much better because,
yes,
these are the better editors, these are the
right,
more reputable referees, etc. So even if you get like a Nature publication in economics at an economics department, that might not get
wow,
you.
okay. I did
as
not
far.
know, I did not realize that. That's very interesting side effect. I mean, of course, we probably, we can kind of that's a we can talk about that for for a very long time, I suppose. But I find that to be very interesting as well. There are things about funding and all these other questions that we can talk about. But that's I feel like that's something that can, there should be a process to correct it, right? So, but anyway, let's get back to our original topic of conversation. So you were in, of course, as you mentioned, which is in prestigious universities. You were in Yale and of course and Berkeley, and of course you were in Cambridge as well. And you participated in many. I mean, you've been cited 700 times, more than that, I think now, which is a huge accomplishment. If you as a researcher, and I wonder, as a researcher who is quite established now, I wonder what are some of the failures. And I don't mean this, of course. I mean, people who are successful are people who really understand what failures are and was able to move through it. And I think you and I were talking about it when we were previously talking about it, where failure is an important part of the process. So what are the things that you felt that were failures that you had to learn from in order for you to be better and of course to improve your career further? Because as researchers, you would it's a lonely road that you're traveling, right, in some ways. And yeah. What are the kind of things, I mean, what are things that you may be able to share?
Well, I mean, academia is a very rough,
yes, exactly, yes,
environment, right? And it's getting more and more so, right? There are many PhDs being pumped out of universities, and there is no way of absorbing them into academia, right?
Yes.
And you've got a lot of precarious situations. I've got a lot of friends struggling there. I struggle, even if you got a couple of good publications that used to be enough to get you a lifetime position 20 years ago, doesn't do that anymore.
Right.
And there are many other constraints. As you say, you have to secure funding, which is getting more and more competitive. And that also constrains your freedom, right? I said, it's one nice thing is you've got an idea or you talk about something, you meet somebody at a conference, you have a coffee, you talk about a nice question, and then you're like, oh, let's do an experiment on that. That's how it should be. But you need to convince people to fund your
yes.
ideas.
Yes.
And you need to convince people to publish your ideas. And those are two huge filters. And in the end, you end up not being as free as you'd wish to. And then many things are just infeasible, right? So one of the things I wanted to move into is more practical research, which means field experiments, which means working with actual organizations, actual teams, and then look at trust and cooperation in there. And then you need industry partners, right? You need people who are willing to cooperate with you in your research. And that's another thing that's exceedingly difficult, right? If you talk to managers and try to convince them to randomize some treatment in their organization, they get understandably
Yes, of course.
cagey, about it. So there are many restrictions like that, and I think that was one thing that made me reconsider my academic career. Plus, private issues that also. So one thing that is also very common in academia is, you tend to do assortative matching, right? Your partner is probably also an academic.
Right. Yes, of course.
So, and then what happens a lot is, with that kind of job market, trying to find a place where both of you can work is exceedingly difficult. So
never thought about that, but that's so true. Like all my professors when I was in university, their wives or their husbands were also university staff. I never really thought about it until I just mentioned it, but that's so true.
Sociologists have studied that for a long time, and I mean, you just you always say opposites attract, but socioeconomically you tend to match close to your own sort of
as they say, wheelhouse, as they say in the United States.
Yeah, exactly. And that is a problem if you have to be geographically flexible for your job. And that's a common problem. It's called the two-body problem, jokingly. So and so that was something that we also faced, and then with family, there are certain pressures that you need to accommodate, and academia is not great at that. Especially, it was interesting to see how that developed during COVID, because during COVID, obviously, all the teaching and all the meetings, everything was online. And remote, and that is in principle possible, right? At least for disciplines like mine. Of course, if you're a chemist or a biologist, you can't run your experiments remotely. You have to be in the lab. But especially when it comes to teaching or to researching, to writing, you can do that online, no problem. But then, of course, if you're in a brick and mortar university, they will insist to do brick and mortar stuff, right? It's a bit like what you saw with all the other companies. Like, okay, this was enough. Let's go all back to the office. And for universities, it's really the business model that's at stake there, right? Why would you be able to command such a high fee if what you're doing is at the end just a MOOC, right? Just like you could also go to I'm exaggerating, but you could also go to Coursera, right? And
absolutely, exactly. I was about to say,
and so of course all the brick and mortar universities, especially the ones that command a premium price, they will ask to do everything on site, right? And so
absolutely.
I mean, my latest move was to say, I can't do that right now for personal reasons. I need to be geographically flexible, also in terms of my schedule. And I combined that with the love I've developed towards executive education, because I find that, especially as an economist, very very nurturing for myself and for my students, the managers that come to my class. It's very rewarding in terms of interaction, because they bring a lot of grounding, a lot of reality checks to how academics think about the world. And we can give them a lot of perspective,
Absolutely.
from a more theoretically grounded view and more scientifically grounded view. Tell them, okay, what you're experiencing is actually a very well-known phenomenon. And you can name the bias, and you can tell them, look, why don't you try X, Y, or Z? That's been interventions that have been shown to help. And so it's more of a dialogue, and it's much different than when you teach undergrad students.
Absolutely,
and
absolutely.
I came to cherish that a lot. And so yeah, I'm moving towards online executive education now.
Yeah, I know you have a very exciting program coming up, so we're definitely going to talk about it in a minute. But just so that we've been talking a lot about research, so let's go back to a little bit of the interlude and talk about another one of your favorite books.
Yeah, I also read a lot of nonfiction, both, of course, for my research and for my teaching.
Absolutely.
But also, since my youth, I've been interested in history and also social issues, and I think some things that are informing my current outlook and also my teachings. Certain thinkers like Piotr Kropotkin, it's a 19th century scholar who wrote about how cooperation is actually a big driver of evolution, right? So he was an anthropologist, he was a social scientist, he was a political figure, very interesting. Like, in the 19th century, you could still be all of these things at once.
Yes, absolutely.
And his main point was that cooperation is a big factor in how not only humans but also animals organize. And he was pushing back towards against this sort of social Darwinism view that it's a fight between individuals
Right.
for survival, and all these nasty things that came out of that, eugenics and all that kind of things. And he gave a lot of examples, from medieval guilds to certain animals he found while he was doing research in Siberia, and very fascinating stuff. And it's very much guiding my view of also how organizations can work and should work, and how they can foster cooperation. Of course, then you have to update that with research. So you've got things like Elinor Ostrom, who got the Nobel Prize on how commons are managed, right? Common pool resources, how people can come together and, for example, irrigate their fields in a fair and an efficient manner. And that never turns out to be either, Stalinist top-down kind of organization, nor something like a corporation or a free market. It's always stakeholders come together and they figure things out in a cooperative way.
Yes.
And these things are very interesting.
It is just reminded me of the micro loans, the idea of micro loans. It's a very fascinating. I think he won the Nobel Prize as well. So it's a very and one other thing I also thinking about was that, is it something that you find interesting? So this research that happened at that time, 19th century, 18th century, which of course they had a different view about the world to us, but there is some truths in those researches that are still almost, let's say, timeless, right? How do you kind of marry those two things together to what you do right now? So what I mean by that is, so I mean, there are, of course, from Darwin to a lot of other researchers who did these things, but then they are now, with the help of the internet, social media, maybe things are not exactly behaving in the same way, right? How do you kind of normalize those ideas?
I mean, obviously, a lot of things have changed since the 19th century.
Yeah.
And what I always try to do is keep the perspective on the history of thought, because what I see a lot is not only in academia, where you have a focus on what's the latest and greatest in my very narrow field, but also in business literature, where every couple of years you've got a person who claims to have found the biggest thing since sliced bread, and then you go back and you read something from the 19th century, or I always joke that probably Plato has written about that 2,000 years ago. But nobody knows, because you lose that kind of perspective. And I mean, of course you do, because there's this onslaught of publications, and nowadays it's impossible to have a broad view of all these things, but at least you can try, and at least you can be skeptical about, okay, is this really new, or is this an old idea, and should we probably look at what other people have thought about this across time? But yeah, today you've got a lot of researchers who are in that kind of trajectory. You've got for example, in the 1960s, you had somebody like Murray Bookchin, who kind of married the idea of freedom and decentralization, and instead of top-down oppressive hierarchies, have people self-organize with ecology, right? A very prescient thinker. In the 60s, he was writing about CO2 emissions, and we should stop that. Through basically free people come together and make decisions together from the ground up. And then you've got modern thinkers like Ostrom, who do a lot of hard research on these things, like how do people organize? What are the factors that make these things work? Especially in economics, you would say social dilemma situations, like public goods, common pool resources, where if everybody's a selfish person and there's no checks or balances, then we'll end up in disaster, like climate change. And that's very, very timely research. So what do we need? Like a couple of modern insights, like when you have a resource like that, it needs to be delimited in a sensible way, because if you can't delimit, like, what is the research, who are the stakeholders, it gets very difficult to organize.
Absolutely.
Right? And to keep people from misusing the resource, and to discipline people who transgress, who use too much, who pollute too much, etc. So there's a lot of modern research, but I think it's important to keep an eye on the history of thought, because that I see many people are not doing that. There's unfortunately another person who passed away recently is David Graeber, anthropologist, very influential on modern thinking, especially on bureaucracies, right? He's brought this focus back on, let's say, ethnographic view of organizations, which tended to be a bit niche, right? Especially for economists. We always want numbers, but having actually people go and live in these organizations, and to interview these people gives you sometimes more insight than
Absolutely.
the data.
Absolutely.
he wrote a lot about bureaucracy. Like Bullshit Jobs is a book that is a great read. Right? You know how in modern corporations nobody seems to do a job that is actually super productive.
Right.
And he's got another one. It's called The Utopia of Rules, about bureaucracy, which is also something I talk about in my new course. You know, bureaucracy is something that is supposed to be helpful. Right? It was invented to be helpful. Right? It was an evolutionary step away from nepotism and people being in charge who have no idea what they're doing, and being sort of a bit more meritocratic. I mean, things like the Chinese civil service exam.
The British civil service,
yeah, sure. And these kinds of things were supposed to be a step forward, right? Bureaucracy as a step away from these old ways of organizing. And I think it was Lenin who said, you know, I want our state to be like the German post office,
right?
Because or the Prussian post office. But back then, that was like the pinnacle of organizing.
Absolutely.
And of course, nowadays we know that there are many problems with that, and I think anthropologists like Graeber are a very valuable source on why that is and what we could do better. So these are a couple of books like from the 19th century to 20th century that have guided my thinking about, you know, how can we organize in a free, non-dominating, bottom-up way, and kind of cure these organizational diseases that give us, you know, corporate scandals and climate change, all these things. Yeah.
Actually, it's very you know, just to recap the whole idea, right, that we were talking about for the past few minutes. And you know, and what you were telling previously is that, you know, so you know, it's this blue sky thinking. You have these material from the history and, you know, what maybe other people are thinking about, and then kind of have to, you know, almost have to have this convergent view, and then say, okay, I'm going to, you know, focus my attention onto this scope or this area, and then, you know, you also have to predict, or you have to kind of transpose it almost into, where am I going to publish? Where am I going to, you know, what is the audience I'm going to, you know, all these things have to be mapped out in a much more linear fashion, and then is when you actually start doing the work, right? So it's a huge, like, people think that, you know, researchers just stay in labs and do whatever that they do, but actually that's not the case at all. There is a huge amount of work, that pre-work that has to be done in this modern times, where, you know, it's all driven by economics in a different way. But you know, this lack of funding, there is the you know, as you said earlier, there are a lot of PhDs out of, I don't know the exact numbers, but, you know, let's say if there are 100 PhDs coming out, I'm not 100% sure that if most of them will end up in academia or just simply go into a job, right? And so there is some ways that there's a knowledge that we are creating, the new knowledge that we are creating, somehow almost getting a bit stale, because, you know, because there are no new thinkers, that there are not new thinking, but at the same time, there is a way that what you're saying is that we have a way to almost some ways recycle and build something new from it, right? So that's, I think, it's a great, because there's this idea that there is nothing new, right? Everything that has to be discovered already has been discovered, but it's just a way of, you know, how we can put it together in a different way to match the circumstances. So that was an amazing you know, insight. Thank you for that. So just to you know, finish off our conversation, what is next for you? You mentioned quite an exciting thing that you're trying to, you know, not trying, you are already doing, which is please tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a combination of an executive education program and also going to be a book this year on this topic, right? So I did a lot of education, executive education on different topics, behavioral economics, decision making, behavioral finance, quite a lot with people from the City of London, and there was always in our discussions this push towards, okay, but I'm confined in this environment. You tell me this is a bias, but I can't actually do anything, right? How do I manage this in the situation where we've got lots of people working together in an institutional framework, and these constraints are insurmountable, right? And these biases, decision biases, they're almost baked into the system.
Absolutely.
And that brought me back to this idea of cooperation among free people who are not dominating each other, right? Because a lot of the problems, also if you look at it from an economic perspective, come from things like, you've got resources, and then you exert power by distributing the resources and currying favors, what's oftentimes called rent seeking, and then you've got asymmetric information. So you've got this typical thing where you've got an IT expert in your company who's making themselves indispensable because they're the only one to be able to run the stuff, even if everything is nicely documented and everything. If you fire that one person, everything breaks down. So these kinds of information asymmetries are very bad, and then you've got these career incentives where you're hustling to get the promotion. And the solution to me is found in a lot of companies and organizations who try to do it differently, right? You've got everything from, let's say, Occupy Wall Street and social movements, but also companies like Ricardo Semler, like the Semco. He wrote this famous book Maverick, right, where he says how I revolutionized my company in the 80s in Argentina by basically unbossing, and giving everybody more freedom, more autonomy, and also more responsibility, and that popped up in different places. You've got a lot of talk about hire in China, for example, like this idea of the corporation as sort of the platform for intrapreneurs. So you've got a lot of these ideas popping up here and there, and they resonate again with historical examples. Like I always like to bring up the Quakers, which is a religious community that basically functions with the same principles, bottom up.
Right.
You don't have a pope, you don't have a person who's a clerical authority. And so I created this course that tries to talk about, okay, why is that, has this idea of bottom-up organization, has that a superior potential to the classic organization, classic corporation, or other forms that we see right now. And we talk a lot about, the economic principles behind that, incentives, incentive design, cooperation, public goods problematics, etc., but also the psychology. We don't actually accept authority very well, right? And I always bring that up as this weird schizophrenic mindset that we all want free markets. We want to be able to work where we want to work. We want to buy what we want to buy. We don't accept a planned economy, and we also don't accept dictatorships in politics. Right? We want to be able to choose, right? We want to have a democracy, and then you go to work, and then you have this top-down hierarchy, and then it's the complete opposite. And Absolutely. Why is that? And does it have to be that way? And I'm inspired by Kropotkin's insights. You've got beehives, right? And there's a queen bee, but the queen bee is not a queen, right? Yes. there's no authority. They organize themselves, and they have these magnificent structures and complex behaviors
Yes.
through self-organization, bottom-up organization,
Yes, absolutely.
and trying to use all of these insights from very disparate academic fields, from very disparate case studies, nature, social movements, different kinds of organizations, corporations that try to organize like that, and try to distill what are the qualities that you need to build your own organization like that. And that's
I mean, when you're talking about it, obviously this is going to be a podcast, so it will be available on YouTube as well. But I can just see how much you're passionate about what you're talking about, right? It just comes out of you. It's so cool. It's already been deployed now. I think it's already available in certain universities and online as well, right?
Well, there is a sign up. The first cohort is going to start in April.
Okay.
The book is going to come out in summer. And yes, so a couple of universities have showed interest. So I will do a workshop here and there in Switzerland in September, for example. But obviously, that's developing.
Yes, of course.
But yeah, so yeah, it's
Exciting.
starting right now. Yeah.
Absolutely. All the information about the course, as well as the details, will be available in the show notes. It'll be available, of course. We will post that to Twitter, and will be available in Reddit as well. So you can check that out. It'll be available. All the information will be available in the show notes. So to end our conversation, I want to kind of ask you a more personal question, right? So you have come all this way, and you have contributed compared to many people, I would say, you have contributed to the knowledge of this world, right? That's a huge achievement. So if you were asked the question, if you never had the opportunity to thank somebody, and if you wanted to take this opportunity to thank someone, or could be many people, not just one person, but if you have to thank someone, who would that be?
I always have to thank my parents, because I had all the opportunities that got me there, and huge privilege to be loved by two parents in a very secure environment. And I have to thank you said I've contributed to knowledge. I don't subscribe to that idea that any individual actually contributes to knowledge. It's a web,
Right, of course.
The web,
yes, it's a very good way of looking at it.
Includes the entire world, right? And every scholar that has come before, and of course all my colleagues at all these wonderful institutions, and my friends and my partner. There's a lot, both in terms of just emotional support, but also just intellectual exchange.
Right.
I mean, she's not in my field, but that makes it even better.
Right. Have a different perspective, right? That's yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, I mean, there are too many people to thank. But yeah, I'm just grateful for where I am right now. It wasn't always easy.
Absolutely.
But I think it's the direction I'm heading right now was very exciting, actually.
Absolutely. And I think from our previous conversations as well, what you talked about today, I think it's something that I personally would be looking forward to your book as well. And I think for sure, I think it will be something really valuable and useful for many organizations, right? So I really wish you all the very best in this new endeavor that you're taking up as well. So just to finish our conversation, as a final pick, what is your final book that you love to share with us?
Well, so if you're interested in what I just said and you can't wait for my book, there's another quite good book by Frédéric Schneider, another Frederick,
Yes.
Reinventing Organizations. I'm a bit more of a down-to-earth person, so I would skip the first 60 pages that are a bit more like teleological and more, a bit almost new agey. But other than that, it talks a lot about these things like non-domination and bottom-up and decentralization in organizations. It's a very good read. There's yeah, I mean, there are many other books.
Of course.
If you're more tech inclined, you've probably read Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism.
Oh yes, that's an amazing book. Yes,
an amazing book that everybody should read.
Yes.
Because it's about all of us right now in the world, not only on the web, but
absolutely. And that book is especially cool because everybody, I've seen it everywhere. A lot of places say that if you're not paying for something, you're the product. She talks about it in a very different way, where she says actually that is not true, right? I would recommend anybody to everybody, as you said, to read that book, because it will give you a very different perspective as to what our society is like, and especially companies like Google and what they're actually doing, right? So it's very interesting, especially with regards to the power of data. So thank you so much for your time once again, especially on a Sunday, to give us your time. I so appreciate it, and to share your wisdom and your knowledge about how you've come here and also the things that you're about to do. So thank you, and I really wish you all the very best, and hopefully speak to you soon again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was great to be there and to be able to talk to you, Shirosh. Very nice.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.